Hey all, I hope you've been well. So I took some time off, but I'm back on my videos. I wanted to come with a new video today that's a little different from what I normally post. I normally just speak strictly on attachment styles. Today's video is kind of like the root of what can initiate and start an attachment style. I want to talk on this phenomena of betrayal of the safe parent, okay? Today's video is for a very specific type of dynamic. A lot of us were raised in homes where we had one parent that we deemed as the safe parent, the constant parent, right? The one that constantly showed up, the one that was always available, gave us the material, the house, the things, right? And then we had a very outwardly loud, toxic parent, right? There's no denying the toxicity. So when we have a dynamic like this growing up, right, it becomes very easy to point the finger specifically at the outwardly loud, chaotic parent, right? We cling to the parent that's constant. We trust the parent that's constant. We tend to kind of lean into looking for validation from the toxic parent because of, obviously, if we know intermittent reinforcement. But I'm talking about in terms of who we consciously and subconsciously know is safe, who we consciously and subconsciously know will always show up, right? That this is the parent we may tend to take for granted because they're so constant. But growing up, the outwardly toxic parent becomes like the scapegoat in that situation, right? Between the two parents. One thing that I think we really take for granted, right? We don't always look at the damage that is done from the safe parent. So let's use the example of saying you had a safe father and your mother was chaotic, okay? We don't realize that we have daddy issues. If that specific parent did not do what they needed to do to remove you from the situation, to heal themselves, their own enmeshment, codependency, their own hidden toxicity, because a lot of times that other parent does have their own toxicity. It's just hidden behind the more chaotic, loud parent, right? But it is still there. It's just hidden beneath all the extra. But a lot of times we don't realize, like in this dynamic that I'm explaining, dad is the more consistent, mom is chaotic. We have daddy issues. You do not just have mommy issues. You also have daddy issues. And something that we do not realize, and it took me, because I've had a similar situation, it took me a long time to realize, in a very covert way, the safe parent actually is your biggest trauma and actually can be your biggest hurt. And I know this is very conflicting, confusing, even painful and hard to reconcile, because in your mind, this was my constant parent. This was the one that always showed up. This is the one that had the material, got me from A to Z, blah, 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 all the things, right? But when we have these dynamics of highly volatile, constant parent, but they don't remove you from the situation, or maybe the way that they emotionally handle themselves as, because they're human, even though they're adults, they're human. Maybe they didn't handle their hurt and pain well. We always assume our blueprint is solely from our highly volatile, highly toxic, loud, chaotic parent, right? And it is. That is a huge role in it, because if they weren't there, if they showed up differently, things would probably look very different. Maybe if they weren't as chaotic, the other parents' flaws may have shown a little bit more. You never know, right? But they are a part of the blueprint for sure. But again, it's easier for the brain to accept and reconcile, especially when you get to the point of no longer needing validation from that parent. But the real work comes into play. I feel like first we kind of accept things with the toxic parent. But after we work through that, we realize there's still something within us that just isn't right. Something within us that just still feels empty, right? And I went through this for quite some time in my healing journey. It took me a time to realize I might have some daddy issues too. And granted, anybody that knows my father and I, we've always been very close. That's my dog. It'll always be my dog for life. But my mom has been in and out of rehab, right? So it put us in situations where we're going to Alcoholics Anonymous, going to retreats to try to understand. And what was so crazy, we went to the retreats thinking we're going to learn more about alcoholism and, well, what's wrong with this lady? What's wrong with my mom? We actually ended up with my mentor, love her to death, realized how codependent we were. Through going to these retreats, through unraveling things, really breaking down our blueprint, our relationship. My dad and I realized how we were too entangled. Through these retreats and all the things we've experienced these past years, it's been years of it, there's been a lot of realizations of parentification. The true damage of not leaving an unhealthy situation. And one thing that was really difficult for my dad and I in this process is realizing it wasn't malicious. Now, where our chaotic, toxic parent is like, oh, it's malicious, you're doing this strategically, whatever. Some cases they are, some cases they aren't. Sometimes it's total, they're just in a total survival mode. It's not conscious. But a lot of times with this constant parent, coming to terms with the fact that they thought they were doing what was best at that time. You only know what you know. And that's not making an excuse and letting it off the hook, but it is a reason, okay? So that's something that my father and I deeply had to work through. And as we started sorting through all of this, and it was not an easy process, I'm going to be very honest. Anybody that grew up in a dynamic like this, especially when that safe parent is your dog at the end of the day, it's not fun. It's not easy. It sucks. There are a lot of moments where you go through phases of feeling resentment, anger, but you're confused because you still love them, right? And as we broke this down more, I started realizing my blueprint for how I showed up as a woman. And I've always shown up masculine, hyper independent, because of, when a parent chooses to stay, for a child that equates to, okay, I have to protect myself. That's where a huge bit of avoidance comes into play, right? I started seeing that my blueprint was not just solely from my mother. And a lot of us, as we work through this, we realize it is not just solely from that outwardly toxic parent. It is from the safe parent. Having to work through that level of grief it's brutal. It's brutal. It's painful. You go through a huge ego death. You go through a huge, your whole thoughts, blueprint, the lens that you've viewed life through. I mean, it's all shattered. Everything gets shattered. The way that you've been viewing this solid parent as being just almost godlike, you know that they've made mistakes. You know that they dismissed you or did whatever, but because they've had to overcompensate for the toxic parent, in the same breath, they're like, you're a hero. We have idealized my parent, which is how we start the process of idealizing people in relationships too. We learn to do it early. Hey. But anyway, your whole being and idea of life just temporarily gets shattered. I'm going to be very honest with you. And then right after shattering the illusion of that parent and seeing them as a human for the first time in your life, you learn to see both parents as human beings. You have to work through the grief. You have to work through forgiving while also realizing that you do love them. Then you have to go through the grief of looking at self and looking at how this whole mess has affected you and how you show up, your rage, your idealization, how you're inconsistent. For me, super detached, super avoidant. That's when the real work comes into play. But I'm not going to go too deep because I do like to point things out to get people's minds going, but I always push therapy, do self-help, do therapy. If this is a dynamic that sounds familiar to you, this is not something I'm putting in play for you to be angry at both of your parents. It's not to hate your parents. This is actually a way to preserve self and to preserve the relationship if that parent is willing to do the work with you. Let me say that again. If they're willing to do the work with you and if they're willing to be accountable. In my situation, my father is willing to be accountable. Sometimes we don't get that luxury. And that is where you don't stop doing the work. You still do it. And you just have to It's radical acceptance. Either way it goes, it's radical acceptance. But if you have a parent that's not willing or ready to step into that level of accountability, that doesn't mean that your personal work stops. You still presume with your work, your realizations, your process, and you radically accept the reality. And sometimes that will leave you in a situation where you may feel like you don't have either parent, but you have your damn self. And I know for those of us that were raised in volatile, codependent families, that's like the scariest thing ever. And my dad and I, we went through a temporary phase where it was like, kiss my ass. Like, I went through that phase. There's always that phase. And I didn't know if we were going to bounce back from it or not. But I was willing to rock the boat if that meant I get to take care of this for self, right? And that just has to be territory that you have to learn to not be afraid to step into regardless of the result. And that's with anything in life. Regardless of the result, you have to be willing to preserve self in a healthy way, not in an avoidant way, not in a volatile way. So I just wanted to speak to that. If this resonates with you, maybe deeper dive into it, look into a local therapist. As I always say, our childhoods, our experiences are not our permanent situations, are not permanent blueprints. Anything can be changed, anything can be corrected, but you just have to be willing to do the work and let go. So, again, there is such thing as betrayal trauma from your safe parent. You're not guilty for feeling it. You're not wrong for feeling it. But you are doing a huge disservice to yourself if you don't take the necessary steps to also heal it. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Peace, love, and healing, babies.